Well, good evening, everyone. We want to get started. I'm sorry we're a couple minutes late, but traffic being what it is in this town, it's almost inevitable. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I'm David Clement. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions at St. Petersburg College. On behalf of President Tanja Williams and Campus Provost Mark Strickland, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this campus for this important event. This is by way of familiarizing you with SPC if you aren't. This is one of 10 campuses in the SPC system. We are the higher education choice of 2/3 of the high school graduates in Pinellas County. And we have a fall enrollment this fall of around 35,000 students in the system. And this campus is also host headquarters for this institute. Tonight's program is an example of the kind of programs we present on a regular basis to promote civic engagement and good public policy. I'm especially pleased to be able to present the constitutional amendments as one of these programs. Every general election, when we get to the bottom of the ballot and find this bewildering array of issues to be voted on, we wonder, what is this? I'm not a lawyer. Well, for those of you who are good enough to come out tonight, and a few are still coming in, you won't have to pretend to be one. Our moderator is going to explain each of the amendments proposals in layman's terms, and then advocates for and against 4 of those amendments will come up 2 by 2 to argue for and against them in a little bit more extended format, about 15 minutes each. And if you stay till the end, there will be a question and answer session for you for any of the amendments that you have a question about. I know it's always tough, as I said, to understand the amendments, but this year it's going to be especially tough because there are 12 of them on the ballot. Most years it's only 3 or 4, some years 1 or 2. Well, that's because, a good reason. This is the once every 2 decades year when the Constitutional Revision Commission gets together to recommend changes to the Constitution. And it meets, yes, every 20 years. Florida is the only state in the Union that has that unique system to revise its Constitution. That's only one of the ways that we can revise the Constitution. The other 2 are by citizen initiative for people to gather signatures of 8% of the votes from the last election to put something on the ballot. And the other way is by the legislature voting to put it on the ballot. And if it can do that just with a vote of the House and Senate majority. This ballot will contain amendments put there by all 3 of these methods. In fact, 7 of the proposals were put there by the Constitutional Revision Commission. But, I hope I don't lose you here, those 7 actually contain something like 20, I'm not sure exactly, 18 or 20 separate proposals. That's because the CRC decided to bundle several issues, sometimes 2, 3, and even 4 in one case, under a single title. You can't vote on those separate issues within one separately. It's a vote yes or no on the title. I'll leave it to our moderator to explain the rationale for this and to bring context to each of the issues. And let's meet him now. I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Frank Alcott, an associate professor of political science at New College in Sarasota, where he teaches courses on world politics, international law, and environmental policy. He is the former director of the Environmental Studies program at New College, as well as the former director of the Marine Policy Institute at Mote Marine Center in Sarasota. He has held positions as a senior Fulbright Scholar to New Zealand, a senior fellow within the Florida Collins Center for Public Policy, and a Belfer Fellow in the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Dr. Frank Alcott.
Good evening, folks. All right, we got a lot to cover here. Are you ready? Just a little bit of background and just a little bit of correction. No offense, David. We actually have 5 ways to change the Constitution in the state of Florida, in addition to legislative joint resolutions on the part of the legislature and citizens initiatives, which are the 2 most common. We have a Constitution Revision Commission, which meets once every 20 years to scan the Constitution and propose changes. Very powerful committee. I'll come back to that in a second. That's the 3rd way. There's actually something called the Tax and Budget Commission. That's like a subset of issues. There are lots of tax and budgetary components to our Constitution, and so that staggers, and that meets also every 20 years, but the opposite 10-year periods that our CRC meets. And then the 5th one, it hasn't happened in quite some time, but we can call a constitutional convention in the state of Florida. We're operating under our 5th Constitution. It was put in place in 1968. Chairman of that convention was a fellow by the name of Chesterfield Smith, smoked big cigars, colorful character, but I remember a quote was that the citizens of Florida should be the ultimate repository of change. They also made it easy to change the Constitution in Florida on purpose. They looked at a state in late 1960s that they thought was going to undergo dramatic changes. They were right about that, but they thought that the Constitution should change along with the times, and that the ultimate repository or citizens should have the ultimate say in yes or no, and having to approve things by the ballot. So I do get questions sometimes when I come out and talk about the constitutional amendments. Why do we have so much stuff in our Constitution? This doesn't really belong in the Constitution. Well, yes and no. The Florida state Constitution is very different than our federal Constitution. It was designed that way on purpose. You have to make your own judgment calls about what belongs in there and what doesn't. We're very different than from the federal Constitution, but there are some states out there that are even wackier than we are in terms of how much they have there. Just a couple of words about the Constitution Revision Commission and why this year is different. We have there were a total of 13. One, Amendment number 8, appears to be taken off the ballot. There's some legal questions. There's a couple of other pending decisions that have to be made probably in the coming days, but just my judgment is that you're probably going to see everything else on the ballot. And if not, if I tell you something that's pro and con or background on an amendment and it comes off, well, at least you know what it would have been if it. So to be safe, I'm going to go through all of the rest of the amendments. Of the 12 that are on there, 5 of them came through the regular channels of citizens initiatives and joint resolutions on the part of the legislature, and then the CRC, the Constitution Revision Commission, put 8. And a lot of those, 6 of the 8 are what are known as bundled amendments, where they're actually taking very different things, distinct changes to the Constitution, and packaging them together, and you, the voters, are going to have to vote up or down on the entire package. You don't get to distinguish between parts of that. Now, there's a couple of arguments in favor of this that I think that I should acknowledge. One, the past CRCs have always done this. It's nothing new with this CRC. Secondly, there's an efficiency argument, and that if they were to put 20 different amendments before the voters, it might overwhelm you. And so they think it makes sense to package things that go together according to their judgment. And the rationale that they used is the bundles, most of what's in that bundle appears in the same section of the Constitution, but some of the issues are pretty different. And I think one of the things you'll have to weigh, I can't tell you what to do when you find something that you might like and might not like in a bundle, I would hope that they use their judgment that reasonable people, or at least most of them, would look upon what's in a bundle in a similar fashion and not take things that people feel very strongly about in different directions and stick them together. Whether they did that or not, again, that'll have to be your judgment. So that's a little bit of background on the process. So without any further ado, what I'm going to do is within a half an hour, maybe a little bit less. I am going to rip through each and every one of these puppies. I've done it before. Now, and then after I get through everything that is on the state ballot, you may in Pinellas County have some other things on your county ballot. I don't know. I know what's going on in Sarasota. So there could be a few other things that pop up there, but the changes to the state constitution, that is what we will go through tonight. I will get through all of them. Actually 5. So 1 and 2 deal with property rights, and we're going to have advocates, proponents and opponents come up and talk about those after, and then also amendments 3, 4, and 6. And these are some of the more notable amendments that have received considerable attention, a little bit contention, so there's an ongoing debate. And that's not that the other ones don't have any debate around them whatsoever, but these were the ones that we could get speakers on either side to come up. So after I get through with my half-an-hour run-through, we're going to circle back and we're going to go a little bit deeper into 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. No deeper into any of the other ones. At that point, after we make it through all of that, we'll open up the floor to questioning, and I will stand here and answer questions to the best of my ability until you just tuck yourselves out and decide to go home. Okay, you ready? Okay. The first and the second amendment are amendments that were put on by our legislature through joint resolution, and both amendments deal with property taxes. If you have lived in the state of Florida for a considerable period, you notice that you usually do see each and every cycle something to do with property taxes and a constitutional amendment coming up. That's where the relevant body of property tax law is in the state of Florida. So if the legislature wanted to do something to change property taxes, they have to go back into the Constitution to do it. They can't just do that via statute. Amendment 1 is an increase in the homestead property exemption. So for homesteaded properties in the state of Florida, which are properties which are your primary residence, that you've lived here and gotten that status or that designation, right now you actually have a $50,000 exemption on the assessed value that you don't have to pay taxes on. This doesn't apply to the school taxes, but for everything else it applies to. And there is a 3% cap on the assessed value. It can't go up by more than 3% per year. What this amendment would do is it would expand or extend that exemption from $50,000 to $75,000. Now, importantly, it's not the first $75,000. The way that this works right now is that the value of your home, if you live in Pinellas County or anywhere in the state, the value between $0 and $25,000 is exempt. Between 25 and 50, you pay taxes on. Between 50 and 75, you don't. That's also exempt. If this one were to pass, you would still pay taxes on between $75 and $100,000 of value in your home. You would be paying taxes on that amount. But between $100,000 and $125,000, that would be exempt from taxation. The overall Revenue Estimation Commission budget impact for the entire state of Florida for county governments is approximately $750 million. It varies by county, and if you are in a really poor county, there's a designation of a fiscally constrained county where you would get some or all of that money back from the state. You'll hear from the proponents and opponents of that amendment in a little while, so I'm not going to say too much more about that. Amendment 2 deals with non-homesteaded property taxes. So non-homesteaded properties typically are commercial properties, rental properties, second homes. These are the properties that do not qualify for the homestead exemptions. So right now, these properties, there is no bulk exemption like you have for homesteaded properties. There is no $75,000 or $25,000 of exemption, but there is a 10% cap. So for homestead properties, in terms of the amount that the assessed value could go up in a given year is 3%. For non-homesteaded properties, there is a 10% cap. This cap was put in place by a constitutional amendment that we passed 10 years ago, and it's about to expire. What this amendment would do would make that 10% cap on non-homesteader properties permanent. If it were to expire, our revenue estimates are similar to the First Amendment, but it's a little bit different in that you're talking about estimations of property value increases in counties that would go up 10% or more than 10% a year in the future. A little bit more uncertainty around that one. Different types of counties it might affect, but again, I'm going to allow our proponents and opponents of these taxes to make those arguments themselves. So that's Amendment 1. And Amendment 2, they are both property tax related amendments that were put on the ballot by our legislature. Amendment 3 is titled Voter Control of Casino Gambling. What Amendment 3 would do nominally is it would give Florida voters the exclusive right to authorize something known as Title III gaming or casino gaming, authorize it through an approved constitutional amendment in the future if somebody wanted to change things, and the mechanism through which that amendment would appear on the ballot has to be a citizen's initiative. We're going to have proponents and opponents coming up in a little while. I do point out something just ahead of time, though it's important to understand a little bit about what the status quo. It's a very complicated issue, gaming laws in Florida. There's different type of gambling, and depending upon what type you're talking about, you can do it in certain places and not other places. Title III, this is casino gaming. This tends to be slot machines, blackjack, any type of casino-type games where you're playing against the house as opposed to playing against each other, like parimutuel games, which would be horse racing or dog racing or high-lie, or even card room games where you're playing against each other, and bingo. Those are different categories of gambling. But Title III gambling is a specific category, and right now, in the state of Florida, it is only allowed on tribal lands, mostly owned by the Seminoles. The Miccosukee own, I think one or two casinos. And in Broward and Miami-Dade County, there are some parimutuel facilities. Again, these are dog tracks, horse racing, high-lie. They can have a few slot machines. And if you wanted to change that, you would have to go through the constitutional amendment as is. So it's important, I think, to point out that right now, the legislature can't simply do what it wants on Title III gaming. That would have to get a package of expansion approved by the Florida voters. And there's also a number of counties that might be interested in having some slot machines, but they're not allowed to do that either. There was a 2017 Supreme Court decision that sort of took a little whack at Gadsden County and said you can't do that unless you go back through the Constitution. And I'm just simply pointing out that a lot of attention is on having voters control gambling through approval of a constitutional amendment. That actually is the status quo right now. What's different, though, is that under the amendment, if it were to pass, it would have to get on the ballot through one particular vehicle, which is a citizen's initiative, as opposed to the legislature putting something in front of the voters. And so that just a little bit of distinction about what you're voting on, but you're going to have proponents and an opponent talk a little bit more about that in a little while. So that is Amendment 3, Voter Control of Casino Gambling. Amendment 4. Amendment 4 is voting rights restoration, or the restoration of voting rights for felons. What this amendment would do is after a felon completed their prison sentence and parole and probation, they would automatically get their voting rights restored so long as they did not, the felony was not murder or a sexual felony. If they were convicted of a sexual felony or a murder, they would not be eligible to have their voting rights restored. If not, then the restoration of voter rights would be automatic. Who would this impact? It would impact a large number of people, and just a little bit of background that what do other states do? There's a couple of states out there that you could actually vote while you're in prison. your voting rights don't get taken away. But most of the states, almost all states, while you're a prisoner or you're a felon, you cannot be voting. Though most states do automatically restore those rights after your prison sentence, probation, parole and probation are completed. There's 4 states that do it the way Florida does it. In addition to Florida, it's Kentucky, Iowa, and Virginia. Beyond that, we're kind of by ourselves. In the state of Florida, there are, I think, 1.6 million voting age persons that cannot vote. It's about 10+% of the voting age population. The voting age population nationwide that is ineligible due to a felony is more on the order of about 2.5%. So there are some big numbers that are involved, and you'll hear a little bit more about proponent arguments and then opponent arguments when we have our head-to-head debate. But just a little bit of background on what other states do. This one's a little controversial, again, because of the size, the number of people that would affect in Florida just relative to everybody else in the country. Okay, we're going to move now to Amendment number 5. Amendment 5 is a supermajority voting requirement to authorize new taxes or raise taxes or fees. So what this would require would be 2/3 of both the House, Florida House, and the Florida Senate to approve any new taxes or increases, taxes or fee increases. There's another part of this amendment that requires that any taxes or fee increases be pulled out and voted on as a standalone issue. So you couldn't no longer embed taxes within broader pieces of legislation if this were to pass. Good question is, do any other states do it this way? Would we be the only state? No. About 15 states out there actually have supermajority voting requirements for tax or fee increases. About half of those, I believe 8, it's a 60% threshold. And the other 7, it's a 2/3, like the Florida is proposing threshold. So Amendment 5, supermajority voting requirement of both chambers, and any tax or fee increases could not be embedded. They have to be voted on as standalone issues outside of broader pieces of legislation. Amendment 6, we are now, both Amendments 3 and 4 were put onto our ballot through citizens' initiatives. And so citizens' initiatives require a significant number of signatures to be collected. There are also some rules that they can't all be collected from one particular county or congressional district. It's actually done by congressional district. And so usually it does require considerable amount of resources. It's not pure, grassroots. There's definitely some. Amendment 3, just to go back for a second, most of the money, and I think our debaters will confirm this, Disney and the Seminole Tribe have put most of the money up to promote, actually to get the signatures and to promote the amendment. And for Amendment 4, also another citizens initiative. It's a broader collection of folks that have put money behind, but I think the most prominent one is the ACLU putting money behind 4 to come through the citizens initiative process. 5 is a joint resolution of the legislature. So both our Florida House and Florida Senate voted more than 60% to put the supermajority threshold into the Constitution. That would complete your normal amendments, and all of the rest of them, we're now moving on to the Constitution Revision Commission amendments. And so let me start with number 6. Number 6, it has 3 parts to it. Something known as Marsys Law. Part 2 is an increase in the mandatory retirement age for judges from 70 to 75. And Part 3 is a prohibition for our courts, prohibition against deferring to an administrative agency's interpretation of a legislative statute. Let me come back. The first part, again, we're going to have some folks that come up and talk about these things, but given all of that's there, let me just give you a little bit more background, hopefully make their job a little bit easier. The Marsys Law concerns a package of rights for victims and the families of victims. It's a fairly robust set of rights. The name or the term Marsys Law, it comes out of a California case where there was a movement, there was a particular individual and their family, I think they ran into a perpetrator of a crime that had been let out. A lot of the rights were, have to do with notification and just involving victims and their families, notifying them of the criminal proceedings and processes as they're moving along and giving them more room to get involved. Some of these rights, these packages exist as is in our Constitution, either through a constitutional right or through statute, but this is clearly a more robust package of victims' rights. You will have, I think, the resistance to the Marsys Law parts comes from folks that believe that these rights might infringe upon the rights of the accused, and there might be some bumping up between, a little bit of friction between rights that victims' families would have and rights of the accused. And we'll let our folks, our debaters, give you a bit more about that. But I also don't want you to lose sight of the other, particularly the third part. So the second part is an extension of the mandatory retirement age for our judges from 70 to 75 years old. There's, you don't have, if you're on the Supreme Court, you don't have to mandatory retire, but states do it differently. We've had this for a while. If you haven't heard about it yet, I'll just give you a heads up. We're about potentially to go into an area where this becomes pretty controversial because we have a Supreme Court, a state Supreme Court with 7 judges. 3 of those judges, Pariente, Quince, and Lewis, are hitting the retirement age, and so they will have to come off. They will have to step down from their seats. They are known as the 3 most liberal votes on the state Supreme Court. They will have to retire, and it's a little unclear in the Constitution whether the outgoing or incoming governor can make the nominations and make the choices for those seats. There's about to be a big fight, really big if Gillum ends up winning. If DeSantis wins, probably not as big. They might work something out, but stay tuned. This thing, how might it affect it? I get that question a lot. It will not affect these 3 judges. They set the effective date a few months after these judges are required to step down. So this would not affect the 3 judges that have to retire because they're hitting 70, but everybody after that, the age would be 75 for mandatory requirement. There's also one little part of that too, where right now, if you actually have completed half of your 6-year term, by the time you hit 70, you can complete the entire term. You don't have to automatically step down at age 70. This would actually, if this were approved, would erase that part. And so I think once you hit 75, you couldn't then complete your term. You'd actually have to step down at the end of that session or that year. Okay, that's the middle part. The latter part gets my vote for just the thing that nobody's talking about that is pretty important, and that is this language regarding court deference to administrative agencies. There is something known as the Chevron deference principle or Chevron doctrine. It comes out of a 1984 Supreme Court case, National Resources Defense Council versus Chevron. What happened in that case is that our Supreme Court articulated a principle, take it or leave it, that's later become known as Chevron doctrine. And what the Chevron doctrine says is that if there is ambiguity within a legislative or a congressional statute, and that an administrative agency interprets that in a way that the court finds reasonable. They might not be their preferred interpretation, but they find it reasonable. They should defer to that. Again, this is not hard and fast law. This is a take it or leave it principle that a number of justices have used as justification for their jurisprudence decision. It's been used a lot in Florida cases, and there are some folks that think that it's allowed for agencies to sort of expand their discretion beyond a range of comfort. And so this language would prohibit judges from giving any deference whatsoever to an administrative agency's interpretation of a legislative statute. And so that could be significant, could be important. It receives far less attention than the front part of Amendment 6. And again, I don't know where our debaters are going to go, so I'll just give you a little bit more of that background. So Amendment 6 has got the Marsys Law and the extension of the mandatory retirement age for judges and the Chevron doctrine prohibition stuff slapped on to the end of it. A lot of stuff in Amendment 6. Amendment 7. Amendment 7, again, 3 parts to Amendment 7. There is a benefits for first responders and military, surviving members of the military and their families. Best way to explain, the second part of the amendment is a supermajority requirement for universities increasing taxes and fees. And the latter part of it is taking the language regarding the structure of our state university system and putting it into, fleshing it out and putting it into the Constitution. So the language that doesn't exist about how we run our state university system. First part of that, we currently have in our Constitution death benefits for a class of actors under the first responders. And surviving family members of the military, of the armed services, have a robust set of federal death benefits that they get. What would this amendment do? It would expand the state benefits and allow survivors or service members or armed force members to get the state benefits in addition to the federal benefits. And it would also expand the number of actors that you actually have. So right now, policemen, firemen, corrections officers, large group of folks already get it, but paramedics and EMT members are not included within first responder definition currently in the Constitution. So this would expand, include them, and then it puts some language in there that's not there before about the type of benefits, free tuition for surviving members of any of these groups of folks, and then the rest of the benefits they just punt back to the legislature and say, as defined by the legislature. The legislature can come in and tweak this if it were to pass. And so it's a package of death benefits, but it's taking what exists for state and then letting federal or armed services that get federal benefits, but they don't get state benefits. It would give them the state benefits as well, and then it's found some folks like the first responders, EMT, paramedics that are not included in that definition, put them in there too. So that's the first part of this. Second part of it, right now, if you're a university and you want to increase tuition, you want to increase fees at the university, you have to get your Board of Trustees to approve it, and then it also has to be approved by the Board of Governors by simple majority. This would require a supermajority at both the level of the Board of Trustees as well as the Board of Governors. So it's like similarity to Amendment 5 in terms of supermajority to increase something. It's just being applied to our university SUS system. And then, like I said, the last part of that involves taking the language regarding our state university system and putting it into the Constitution. In terms of this is not high-level politics on 7, besides it being a bundle amendment. As far as I can tell, you do have some broad support out there, since we're not debating this after this. You have some broad support out there for expanding those benefits for first responders. A little bit of resistance coming from colleges and universities. Not the Association of Colleges and Universities, but being in a college and university, I could tell you they're not exactly happy with the supermajority requirement. So a little bit of resistance there. The latter part, I just have not heard too much in either direction of it being significant. But so the politics behind 7, not as contentious, but you get some momentum in favor of that front part of it, maybe a little bit of resistance in the middle part of it, and the last part of it's pretty silent. 8, we're not going to talk about it because it's no longer on the ballot. 9, Amendment 9, prohibits offshore oil and gas drilling, and it prohibits vaping in enclosed indoor workspaces. My goodness, if I could go back 7 years, the first part would be the most contentious issue. I don't know if you recall the politics around trying to lift a ban on our state territorial waters. So this is only 9 miles from our coastline, 3 miles on the East Coast, and opening it up to exploration, development, and drilling. Our legislature tried to do that in 09 and 10. It was extremely controversial. Deepwater Horizon blew up. Governor Christ, I'm not sure if you remember, convened a special session of the legislature to try to put on the ballot a constitutional amendment that would look like this one. And the legislature was irate, and he convened it, and they just shut it down in about 5 minutes. And fast forward now to 2018, this apparently is a big yawner. There's just not much resistance to that first part. I think nominally the oil and gas industry still is against it, but we couldn't even get them to come here to show up and argue their side. So this is notable for the lack, really, of resistance on the part of the oil and gas industry, that first part. And the second part, the vaping ban, and my understanding, again, this is pretty much bringing the rules regarding electronic cigarettes into harmony with the rules regarding cigarettes in the state of Florida. So for those people that are vaping, I don't think that you would not be allowed to vape someplace that you're allowed to smoke, but if you're not allowed to smoke, you wouldn't be allowed to vape. So it would be sort of indoor related, but it's nothing like that goes beyond where the rules that we have for regular cigarettes are. So that's Amendment 9. Those two things are put together. The rationale, because I have a lot of interaction with members of the Constitution Revision Commission, which is their rationale for this one was, one is the outdoor environment and the other is the indoor environment. And that's why they go together. Amendment 10. Okay, we're on time. We're going to finish right about on time. So, Amendment 10 is state administrative structure. This one actually has 4 parts to it. Most of the controversy is in the one that I'll point out to the latter part. So, we in our Constitution have language that authorizes a Department of Veterans Affairs, but it doesn't mandate it. This would mandate it. Second part, it would create a state office of domestic security and counterterrorism within the Department of Law Enforcement. We don't have one of those there now. This would create it and require it. It also would take the dates that we, through convention, start our legislative and end our legislative session and put them in the Constitution. In non-election years, it starts in March and ends in May. In election years, they start it in January and end it in March so they can run around and collect money and politic during campaign years. So that's the way they do it, but it's inconsistent. It's not laid out clearly in the Constitution, so they would put it into the Constitution, the legislative dates. And then last but not least, there is a part that would prohibit all counties in the state of Florida from abolishing any of our state constitutional offices, and it would require that they be filled via election. Your state constitutional offices at the county level include your sheriff, your supervisor of election, your clerk, your property appraiser, and who am I forgetting? Tax collector. There we go. Those are the 5. We have non-charter counties in this state, good number of them. Charter counties, they're ones that have their own constitution that invoke this idea of home rule, where unless it's something is explicitly usurped by the state level, they claim their ability to rule themselves. Most counties in the state of Florida just do it this way. They have these 5 offices and they fill them via election. There are some out there that are charter home rule counties that don't. For one reason or other, they've abolished one particular office or they fill them via an executive appointment. And most notably, Miami-Dade actually doesn't have a sheriff. They have a director of police, and that is not an elected office, an appointed office. Volusia, Broward, Miami-Dade have all filed lawsuits trying to stop the amendment, and the counter argument is that it's a violation of home rule. It's the rest of the state telling them how they run their affairs, and if they want to have an appointment in one of these offices as opposed to having an election, they should be able to do that. Sheriff's Association, a number of other folks statewide say all of these offices are important. They should be in the Constitution, shouldn't be able to get rid of them, and they should all be filled by election. So that's where you're getting a little bit of friction on that one. Amendment 11 is sort of a house cleaning amendment. 3 parts to it. Property rights for aliens. Apparently we've got some language in our Constitution that says that if you are an alien that is ineligible for citizenship, you can't own property. Where did this come from? Apparently, like 1880s, 1890s, anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese movements. Nobody really applies it or uses it, but it's in our Constitution. I think every other state has cleaned up their constitutions. We haven't. They want to take that language out of the Constitution. There also is obsolete language regarding high-speed rail. If you recall, if you lived in here, the county for like 15 years, we put in language to have a high-speed rail, and we took it out 4 years later. Apparently, we forgot a couple of clauses. They want to go back in and scrub those out. And then the last part, it actually has a little bit of substance to it. There's something known as the savings clause in our Constitution, which prohibits retroactive consideration of a criminal statute, which means that if suddenly we wake up and decide that our past sentencing laws were draconian and the legislature would like to provide some sort of relief for somebody that was sentenced under the draconian laws, they cannot do that right now because of current language in our Constitution, which prohibits them from retroactively considering somebody's case. And so a little bit of justice reform advocates that are pushing for this, but by and large it hasn't been very controversial. It's been pitched largely as a house cleaning amendment for the Constitution. That is Amendment 11. Amendment 12, this is a package of ethics changes to the Constitution. This has been a big priority of Speaker Rich Corcoran. He pushed a lot through regular channels, but he got to appoint 15 members of the commission. I never mentioned that. 15 by the Speaker, 15 by the Senate President, 15 by the Governor, and 3 appointed by our Supreme Court Justice, George Labarga, and then Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, gets to sit on that. What this would do, right now we have like 2-year prohibitions against lobbying if you were serving in the legislature or a high-level administrative position. This makes that prohibition against lobbying, it kicks it out to 6 years. And then it's pretty robust. It's got a lot of parts to it, but some of the reporting requirements, and it specifies down to even the level of county commissioners if you were elected, or if you were like a city manager, a very high-level appointment, you could not lobby that institution for 6 years after you served. And so relatively, I think, significant package of ethics changes. The biggest part of that is that restriction, that time year change from 2-year prohibition to a 6-year prohibition. A little bit more to it than that, but for the most part, I think that's the most important takeaway from that one. I haven't really encountered it was really important to the Speaker, but there's just not a lot of back and forth or resistance or big promotion of Amendment 12. It just is what it is. It's a package of ethics changes. Okay, 13, last but not least, is your prohibition or an ending to dog racing in the state of Florida. There are currently 12 dog tracks in the country. 8 of them are in the state of Florida. I think there are approximately about 3,000 people in the greyhound industry that make the argument that their livelihoods would be taken away. The animal rights folks are big proponents of ending the dog racing. This would end it, I think, by 2020. For the most part, this is pretty straightforward in terms of the greyhound industry doesn't want you to vote for this. The animal rights folks and a lot of other people concerned about animals would like you to vote for it. The one little wrinkle on this one that almost got it tossed off of the ballot, actually, is that right now, those pari-mutuel facilities that I was talking about, you know, most people going over there, are they going to run the dogs or bet on the, no, they're going to the card rooms in there. But the card rooms, the pari-mutuels cannot have a card room unless they run the dogs. So there's this tether for this type of gaming, which is if you want to have cards in the pari-mutuel facilities, you got to keep running the greyhounds. There's been attempts to sever that link. This would sever the link. And so the pari-mutuel facilities would not go out of business. Many of them would just continue on running card rooms, but not running dog racing. Because this is a significant sort of regulatory component to this, and the amendment didn't mention it, they almost got it thrown off, but the Supreme Court actually did not. They chose to leave it on there. But for better or worse, this does also sever that existing link between pari-mutuel facilities, their ability to have, I think it's Title II gaming, but the card room gaming, and right now they have to do it, run the dog track. So if this amendment were not to pass, then that tether would stay in place for the time being. And that's it. That's we're like 3 minutes over. Okay, so. What we're going to do now is we're going to backtrack to 1 and 2. And I would like right now Ms. Barbara Hasselden, an insurance executive and fiscal conservative, to come up, and she's going to be making the proponent argument for Amendments 1 and 2. And Pat Gerard, Commissioner, Pinellas County Government, she is going to be making the opponent argument for Amendments 1 and 2. Since it's 2 amendments, I'm going to give them about 3 minutes each, and then maybe a little bit of back and forth for a while, and we'll be trying to wrap it up in about 15 minutes and go on to the next one. Thank you. Yes, we are.
Pro first? Well, I'm definitely pro. And first of all, I've heard some discussion, not here this evening, but probably it's going to come up, that this is not the way to address this by having it on the ballot. But I have found that in the first time that the homestead exemption for the state of Florida was entertained was actually very interesting, 1934, during the Depression. And that was the first time that it showed up on our Florida ballot as a $5,000 exemption for people to help them to keep their properties during the exemption and not lose them to tax bills. I thought that was extremely interesting. And then the second time that it's come before us is in 1980, when the first $25,000, it raised it from $5,000 to $25,000, and that was the Democrat-controlled Florida State Legislature referred it to the ballot as Amendment 1, interestingly enough. And then in 2008 is when we had the second $25,000, as was mentioned prior, and again, that was on the ballot. So I've heard repeatedly in the last few months, as this has been discussed, that this shouldn't be on the ballot, you know, this is something unusual, something odd, some quick trick, when in fact it's been on the ballot 3 times, this is the 4th time, and that this is the way that this type of a opportunity is being given to us as taxpayers to be able to catch a break from the rising property taxes that we all have to endure. And in June of this year, 2018, the St. Petersburg Times, the Tampa Bay Times, had an article in the paper about property values jumping, and I went through and just brought out some of the statements because I think it's so revealing. These are just anecdotes out of the quotes out of the article. In further proof of Tampa Bay's red-hot real estate market, the total value of taxable property in the region is projected to rise at near double-digit rates this year. The result will likely be a small windfall for local government agencies. Estimates by property appraisers shows that taxable values, which is defined, this is important to understand, taxable values is the total value of property minus homestead and other exemptions, that are up almost 10% in Hillsborough County and 9.5% in St. Petersburg, and countywide 8.5% in Pinellas County. So fueling the increases are rising home values. This is the bottom line. higher taxable values mean property owners will pay more taxes even if local governments keep the same rates. So at a time when year after year we see rising property values, the taxes continue to go up, and only through an initiative like this do we as homeowners have an opportunity to shave off some of this increasing property values that continues to raise our taxes.
Thank you, Barb. Commissioner Pat.
Yeah, I have no problem at all with this being on the ballot, however I am opposed to it. Part of that is personal. Of course, we have to pass a county budget, and this amendment would cost $42.5 million to county budgets in the first year that it's in place. My bigger issue with this amendment has to do with the fairness. Your property values may be increasing 8 to 10% a year, but if you're a homeowner, a homesteaded homeowner, you're not paying 10% more a year. Your value, that your taxes are based on your Save Our Homes assessment, which is limited to 3% a year. And so me, as a longtime homeowner, I've been in my home 23 years, I probably pay taxes on half the value of my house at this point. And it's great when I go to pay my mortgage, but it's not fair. So what this does is compound that problem. It shifts the tax burden from homeowners, which only comprise about 50% of the households in this county, to those who don't own homes, who are renting or who are renting their homes. It also shifts it to commercial entities and businesses, and I have a problem with continually shifting that burden over to businesses. I think we make it harder and harder for small businesses to survive when we do that. I heard a statistic this morning that rents have increased in this county 27% in the last 6 years. So if you don't own your home, if you own your home, your mortgage payment stays pretty much the same unless you refinance. But if you're a renter, your rent is going up every year, and this is going to make it go up even more. 2/3 of the home, aside from that, there's a very complex, well, not a very complex formula, but one that I'm not going to stop and try to explain right now, of who, if your home is worth $125,000 assessed value, that means minus the Save Our Homes cap, then you will get the full benefit of this. If your home is worth, according to the property appraiser, somewhere between 100 and 125, you'll get a prorated amount of it. Obviously, people who own their own mobile homes, who own their condo that's worth less than $100,000 are not going to see any benefit out of this. And fully 2/3 of homes will not see any benefit. You can go onto the property appraiser's website. He has a great little thing on there where you can plug in your address and it'll tell you exactly what you're going to save.
Okay, so first, just a quick clarification. If you own a home in Pinellas County here, and the home value it exceeds $125,000. Let's just say it's up in that high 1 to high 2 or 3. How much is it going to mean generally?
Well, you'll get another $25,000
right
exemption.
So just to confirm, I've seen the figure for.
What's your question?
I've seen the figure for people that own a home that's over $125,000, probably about $200.
That's what I've heard.
Okay, so we're talking about a $200.
Now you can go on the Pinellas County Property Appraiser's website, and they have a calculator on there, which is very useful. You can put your address in there, and it will instantly tell you what this referendum, if it's passed, will mean to you financially. I wanted to talk about, because I didn't speak in opening comments, about Amendment 2, because I think Commissioner Girard really made the point about how the shifting of going over to non-homesteaded properties, business properties, rental properties, because what we have in 2009, we passed a 10% ceiling on all of the non-homesteaded properties statewide. And now this number 2 is, it had a 10-year sunset on it. So that means in 2019, that's going away. Now stop and think about this. I think this is pretty amazing to think about. So this 10 years of property value growth, these properties would be instantly, if not passed, subject to reassessment at today's rates. So if you own anything that's non-homesteaded, anyone sitting in this room, you will be subject to paying taxes instantly on the new value of 10 years of instant appreciation on that property. It's going to be shocking. And it will affect rents. It will affect businesses. It will affect the price you pay for everything if this does not pass. So we have to keep this in mind that if you pass the amendment number one, which it will give us a break, and then pass amendment number 2, protecting all of these non-homesteaded properties from being pounded for these tax increases. I brought with me.
Okay, I'm going to just switch it. Yeah,
go ahead, sure.
So we didn't do 2.
I get so excited.
So do 2, and then I've got some very specific how it affects county budget questions.
And I will have to say this is probably the only time you'll ever hear me agree with Barb on anything. I think we should pass Amendment 2 because of the fairness issue. But I want to go back to Amendment 1 because I didn't say what kinds of things that $42 million tax loss will mean. That is from our general fund. It pays for animal services, mosquito control, fire districts, law enforcement, EMS services, libraries, parks, and anything that's not an enterprise fund. So that's where those cuts will come first.
Okay, let me, I have a question I'd like both of you to answer.
Well, I'd like to address that.
You can.
Okay, thank you.
So, and because it's a budget question, I think that what I'd like to get at is that let's come back to Amendment 1. There seems to be less to talk about on 2 for the moment. Right. But on Amendment 1, I don't think that it's going to impact all counties just the same. So I would imagine if you have counties where the stock of property tends to be lots of homes in that 100 to 125 range, but not really high value homes, this is going to take a really big chunk out of your budget, might not be as impactful for a county that's got a lot of property wealth in it. Given that, which types of counties do you think are going to get hurt the most, and what do you think they can do about it? Or
well, I think the most densely populated county in the state will be hurt the most, Pinellas County, and perhaps the other urban counties. To answer your question, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we will, yeah. We have the average home is worth over $200,000, I think, now.
How do you think counties will react to the budget hit? A couple of the talking points from the Florida Association of Counties are that you're either going to get a cutback in services, or they'll have to make that revenue up by increasing taxes on other people.
Well, I think they'll use it as an opportunity to tell us what you're saying, when in fact, I was present at a PSTA meeting earlier this year, and I know Commissioner Gerard is on the board of the PSTA, which of course is our bus system, Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority. And I was in attendance at a board meeting this year when the chief financial officer, Debbie Lays, yeah, anyway, very nice woman, very professional, of course, CPA. And she is the chief financial officer for PSTA. And she got up and gave a presentation and assured the board of PSTA that due to the rising property values, that this is going to be a wash, that this will be revenue neutral. And I think that it's very important that we not let this be a talking point about how the world is coming to an end. I have attended hundreds of county meetings over the years that I've been active, and as a citizen, you may know that I've was involved with defeating the Greenlight Pinellas. I was the chair of No Tax for Tracks. And I have attended many meetings, and I can tell you there's a lot of waste going on. And budgets can be cut, but I don't even think that's going to be required because the property increases will set this up according to the CFO of PSTA.
Well, I can tell you that the property tax revenues are more important to the county government than they are to PSTA or the city governments, and the state government doesn't care at all because they don't operate on tax revenue, on property tax revenues. So it will result in cuts. You know, during the downturn, we lost 40% of our property tax revenue, and that was huge. Some of the departments in the county lost 50% of their staff, and they were things like parks and preserves and libraries and, you know, the things that make up our quality of life here. So it's your decision. You can certainly go on and see how it will affect you, but the trade-off is that you will lose some services.
Well, and with regards to the downturn, during that time, this is a good example of what I'm cautioning you about, because you may remember that we didn't used to pay fees to get into our state parks here in Pinellas County. And during the downturn is when the county commission took the opportunity to start charging admission fees to go to our parks, Fort DeSoto, for example. And there's millions of dollars now that are collected off of those fees. And I know that when Commissioner Dave Eggers was elected, one of the first things he did was to inquire of the county, since the economy had turned around, about taking those park fees off, to stop those park fees. And that was told that they need the money now. So, you know, we all know that once there's more taxes, there's always more taxes. There's never enough taxes.
Yeah, one just point of clarification, and then
Sure.
I'll give you like 30 seconds each, just if you
Sure.
want to add anything, because
Sure.
we have to move on to the next one.
Sure.
It's just a mathematical question. So you're talking about increasing in property values, and so the stock of value for homes is going up, and therefore the $25,000 homestead exemption is just offsetting what's going
Part
to
of
be.
it, just a very small part.
But if there's an existing 3% homestead cap, wouldn't
Well, if they
that
raise
have to
the
be,
millage.
So if home value, if you're getting an extra $25,000 of home value protected, in order for that to balance out with rising home values, then 3% of your home value increase would have to be more than $25,000. And so it doesn't really kick in until you're at well over $500,000 in home value. Is that correct?
No, I don't think that's true at all.
But your home value can only go up for 3%. For tax purposes, if you're a homestead
Your
property.
assessed value
Right.
you would have a $25,000 exemption even if your house is worth $200,000. Again, you can go on the Pinellas County property appraisers and you'll see exactly how much you'll save if this passes.
30-second finish, and then we'll.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, you want me to finish? Well, I guess I would just say to further make the point that I was trying to make as pleasantly as I can, is that I just see a lot of waste in both our city governments, and I think it's just, you know, it's just inherent. It's not throwing rocks at anybody. It happens all over the country, probably all over the world, that there is so much wasteful spending that ends up accruing. It's just like cleaning out your closet. Occasionally, you just have to do it. So I don't buy the fact that if we have a small $25,000 additional break to the taxpayer homeowners of this county and the state, that it's going to break the county or the cities or our government in general.
Commissioner Gerard.
Yeah, I don't think we ever said it was going to break the county. Again, it applies to only 1/3 of the people in the county, or the homeowners, actually. Most people will not get anything out of it, even in Pinellas County where our property values are pretty high, comparatively speaking. And again, there's a fairness issue. It's a tax shift. I mean, we've been talking for a good year now about how are we going to cut our budgets if and when this happens. We have no intention of raising the tax rate, but we will have to deal with a loss in revenue. So that's a fact.
Okay, round of applause for Barb and Pat. We're going to move on now to Amendment 3, and I would like Dr. Julie Kessel, President, League of Women Voters of the St. Petersburg area, is going to be making the pro argument, and then we're going to have Executive Director David Clement will be standing in to play the devil's advocate role.
Thank you. I hope I'm not outgunned in this presentation by my esteemed colleague. But thank you. There's three main reasons why I want to put forward why Amendment 3, you should vote yes on Amendment 3 to have the voters have this go to amendment if there's going to be a change. Number one, this is what the citizens of Florida want. So in order to be a citizens initiative, people have to get nearly 1 million people to sign a statement saying that they want this on the ballot. That happened in this case. The Citizens Initiative is the most powerful way in which the citizens in Florida demonstrate their commitment to a particular issue. So 800,000 verified signatures, nearly 1 million signatures. That's one. Second, for years and years, Florida has determined through its rejection of pro-gambling amendments and laws that the Florida voters don't want this. So Florida is considered a relatively non-gambling friendly state. That's the way we like it. That's the way we want it to stay. The voters have made their voices clear. Finally, on this particular issue, 65 to 75% of people polled, and there were 2 large polls conducted as part of this amendment, did not want this, wanted Amendment 3 to pass. They do not want gambling to be in the hands of our legislature. League of Women Voters of Florida believes that civic engagement rules, and the voters should get what the voters want. So we think this represents really terrific civic engagement. We should listen to the voters. Second, we believe that this is an issue of equity. It's very clear that gambling and lower socioeconomic status tend to co-migrate together. 2% of the population have gambling addictions. That accounts for more than $7 billion of cost impact. 5% of suicides are due to compulsive gambling, and 17% of ER admissions for suicidal behavior are related to compulsive gambling. This disenfranchises the most vulnerable people in our population, takes money out of the community for the people who need the money the most. So we believe it's an equity and justice issue. Third, I know I've got a minute, the League of Women Voters believes that big money in politics is a bad thing. It corrupts our democracy, it's corrosive, and there are 270 lobbyists and $50 million spent in dark and not dark, soft contribution money in political lobbying. We believe that the people with the big pockets pay for an outcome to suppress the will of the voters.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Clement.
Well, I would like to start by saying I'm not a fan of casinos. In fact, I have written strong objections to all of the 3 previous times we have voted, in 1978, 1986, and 1994. I'm aware of the negatives that Dr. Kessel mentions about gambling, but I'm opposed to this amendment. Why? Because it is bad government and it is totally unnecessary. Why bad government? It effectively ties the hands of the legislature, whom we elected, from acting on this one area of public policy. We elected our representatives and senators. If we don't trust them to have good judgment, then why have them? Why is it unnecessary? Because state law already requires the legislature to submit any proposal to expand casino gambling in the form of a constitutional amendment. This would prohibit the legislature from even asking voters and create two virtually impossible barriers. One, to gather 8% of the signatures of voters, the number of voters in the last election, and then if you did that, then you have to get 60% of the people to approve any amendment. It seems like stacking the deck to me, or believe me, I'm not one to often quote our president, but he might put it as rigging the election. I would ask, what is it you're afraid of? If you can't trust your legislators not to sell you out? If that's the case, we are in a sad state of affairs. And it could fail to meet the single subject law that applies to citizen initiative. See, you got to put something on the ballot. It would require a petition stating you want to put casino gambling on the ballot. Then you have to say what you want to do with that. That is, approve a casino gambling thing. The Supreme Court could interpret that as two subjects, and that seems like a catch-22, which I don't like. People are always going to gamble, even if it's in their nature. Why should we let the Seminole tribe get all the money, revenue from gambling, when we could get some of it for our state coffers to help pay for needed infrastructure or improve schools or improve health care? And it seems to me it's retrogressive. Gambling is accepted all over the world now. And I would like to quote the incoming president of the Senate, Senator Galvano, if he wins the election. He said, it's game over for the legislature if the amendment gets on the ballot and passes. And at that point, we'll just be spectators in the world of gaming, which will essentially be a monopoly for the Seminole tribe.
All right. All right. They're feisty. I'm going to have to ask some tough questions.
Don't ask me any tough questions.
I'm going hard on either side. So, Dr. Kessel.
Yes.
Last election cycle in 2016, I remember a solar amendment that I didn't like, and neither did the League of Women Voters, because it misled voters by saying that this was actually going to promote solar energy when it didn't. It was really about big money protecting their monopolies. Isn't it true that this amendment's kind of similar in that it's being pitched as voter control of gambling when voters already have control of gambling? It's just making it much more difficult and taking it out of the legislature's hand, and the reason being it's Disney and the Seminole monopoly. And so while this might serve the endgame interests of the things that the League cares about, isn't this just as deceptive as Amendment 1?
I think that's a really interesting proposal. I mean, because the solar amendment had $26 million of industry money behind it and was misleading in its presentation.
And this one has about the same amount of money?
This has about 27
and it's misleading.
million. 27 million. Most of that is coughed up by Disney, and the second amount is coughed up by
Seminoles.
The Seminoles. So most of it is, in that way, big money. Nevertheless, the polling overwhelmingly supports this. They did gather almost 1 million signatures. We've beaten it back multiple times. There's plenty of gambling in Florida. This just applies to the Class 3 gambling. And I think that, David, you made my argument for me when you said, can we trust our legislature?
Okay. Second tough question, and then I'm going to give one,
Yes.
Bring the hammer down on David over there.
Okay.
My tough question, there was legal challenges to this amendment. Essentially, the main challenge was that, as written, it is unclear if it could be applied retroactively to Miami-Dade and some other counties that actually do have some Title III gaming. So it's explicitly written not to interfere with the rights of the Seminoles or the Miccosukes on tribal lands. That's carved out, but it's silent on other existing exemptions that were already passed in the Constitution. And so what the court found was that it didn't have to clarify. That could be dealt later in another lawsuit afterwards, essentially. So is this not unfair to some folks in Miami-Dade and some other counties that are allowed to have a little bit of extra gambling? It might take that gambling away, that right of that Title III exemption that they have.
I think that will have to be played out in the courts, and it would have been potentially better if it had been even more explicit. I do want to add a comment, since you've given me the floor, to say that the legislature has not been stripped of their ability to tax gambling in the state of Florida, so they still have plenty of opportunity to gather taxes for the community resources. Not necessarily that they would use them for those uses, but they do have that authority.
One last little one is on the legislature. So this would take the legislature out of the game in that it could not propose an amendment for the voters. It would have to go through the citizens' initiative process. And the legislature does not need to conform to the single subject rule to the extent that a citizens' initiative does. So there might be two amendment proposals, one that the legislature does that has a few parts to it that they put on the ballot that actually would be okay according to the Supreme Court, but if you require them to go through a citizens' initiatives, they couldn't do it. First, they'd have to get some money groups to actually collect the signatures, but they could have that amendment thrown out because it doesn't conform to the single.
I mean, those are undeniably true statements.
All right, let me come back to you, David. Okay, let's be clear. There might be some folks in our audience, they don't like gambling, they like the Seminole tribe, and they don't trust the legislature. And if that's where they are, doesn't this amendment just serve their purpose wonderfully?
Well, sure, but I think there are people in the audience and around the state who do appreciate sensible, good government and don't think it should be necessary to tie the hands of their elected officials on this one issue. If we can't trust them, then maybe we just need to elect better senators and House members, and not those who just serve themselves and their special interests all the time. Maybe that amendment that you went over that affects, that has to do with transitioning from legislators to lobbyists, maybe that would help too.
Dr. Kessel, final thoughts? We're right about our end of our time here.
Yes,
so.
My final thoughts are that, in the League of Women Voters' eyes, we believe in good government, participation by the people, equity and justice, and transparency, and keeping big money out of politics. And this particular amendment hits all of those if you vote yes.
I would just say, how do we know what it's going to be like in 20 or 40 years? Just think in 20 years, 2038 is the next time the Constitutional Revision Commission can meet. Well, they can't even take this up, according to what I read. And look at our attitudes, changing attitudes about gambling just in our lifetime of most of us in this room. When I moved to Florida 43 years ago, gambling was anathema everywhere, and now it's in almost every state and all around the globe. So it's just, why be this retrogressive against an unknown future?
Thank you, David. Round of applause for our Amendment 3 litigators. We're going to move on to Amendment 4, and the pro side is going to be made by Dr. Randy Lightfoot, Professor of Social Sciences at St. Pete College here, and the con, Mr. Richard Harrison of Floridians for Sensible Voting Rights. Please come up to the stage. And we're doing good on time. I'm like, we started a little late, and I'm like 8 minutes past, but we're right about where we need to be. We're good. It's all going well.
We're going to blow the time right now.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Lightfoot, you have the floor.
Amendment 4 deals with restoring felon rights. This is an amendment that's long past due, one that is initiated by the citizens of the state of Florida. As we said, it has more than 800,000 signatures in order to get it on the ballot. It is polling about 70% approval at this particular time. This is something that the state of Florida has to come to grips with, because the cornerstone of a democratic government is popular sovereignty, the right of the people to vote and decide issues for themselves. The power belongs to the people in a democratic society. Everyone, or most people, no one in this building can say, well, I have never done anything wrong. Now, we haven't committed felons, of course, but there are things that we have done wrong. And we've gotten a second chance. These people need a second chance. In Florida, as far as felon rights are concerned, we're an outlier. We're way beyond the rest of the nation when it comes to restoring felon rights. Florida is one of 4 states in the union that once you get a felony, that's it, you're done. You can't vote forever. Now, that also means that you put that person in a situation where they can't reclaim, even if they wanted to be a better citizen and they want to try to do those kinds of things, you kill the hope of that person, because when you are not able to vote, you can't sit on a jury, you can't get a lease, there's so many things that will affect your life and the ability to improve the quality of life for that particular individual, simply because that person has lost their right to vote permanently. In Florida, as I said, as an outlier here, there are 5 million felons that cannot vote nationwide. 1.4 million of them are in the state of Florida. 21% of all the felons in the country that cannot vote are from the state of Florida. So something has to be done to bring Florida back in line with just the average state in the union when it comes to restoring felon rights. Florida is an outlier. It has done a disservice to those people that have committed those crimes. And I want to end by saying this. When a person commits that particular type of crime and they have paid their debt to society, and we don't restore their voting rights, it's almost as if we're punishing the person a second time, because they won't be able to get back on their feet and do the things they need to do in order to have a successful life in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Lightfoot. Mr. Harrison, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, let's be clear. First of all, we're not against clemency in appropriate cases. There is a process for granting clemency in Florida, and a convicted felon has the opportunity to apply for clemency through the Clemency Board and eventually have a hearing with the governor.
Now.
If you don't like that process, and there are fair criticisms of it, it's expensive, it can take too long. If you don't like the clemency process, it seems to me the answer is fix the process. The problem is that in order to fix the clemency process, as some folks would like to fix it, you first have to win the governor's mansion, and one party in the state of Florida hasn't been able to do that in 20 or so years. Amendment 4 doesn't fix the process. Amendment 4 completely throws out the process, and it is the constitutional equivalent of having your mechanic tell you that you need a set of tires and deciding that the appropriate thing to do is light your car on fire. That makes no sense. The current system takes every felon's case on an individual basis, case-by-case determination, where that person gets a chance to convince the Clemency Board that they've changed their life around and they should get a second chance. We think that individual case-by-case basis is the right approach. Again, the process can be fixed. Like any process, especially a government process, there's always room for improvement. What Amendment 4 would do is completely throw out the individual approach and say that for all convicted felons, except rapists and murderers, we're going to leave them out, everybody else, which includes a lot of violent criminals, by the way, we're not going to ask any questions. We're not going to consider your case on an individualized basis. We're not going to ask about the seriousness of your crime or whether or not you hurt somebody, whether or not you've actually done anything to show anybody you've changed your life around. We're just going to automatically give all those felons their rights back and hope for the best. That's what Amendment 4 says.
Okay. Let me turn to you.
I want to respond to that.
Yes. So you have an ability to respond to anything that he said. I would come back, though, to just a couple of points because they do come up. It's that this is a broad net. Aside from a murder conviction or a felony sexual offense, you're automatically going to get your rights restored. And so there are going to be some bad characters that have their rights restored. Similarly, I've heard there's a recidivism argument, and that there's a high level of recidivism, and that you are restoring rights temporarily, again, to a large chunk of individuals that are violent criminals that are going to be ending up back in prison. Doesn't it, or shouldn't this process require more of a case-by-case, finer tooth comb than the broad net that we see in this amendment?
The problem that we have is that you talked about the process. We don't have a process. It's broken. You have the governor and you have the attorney general, and they decide when on a case-by-case basis. Now, politics plays a major role in this. During Charlie Crist's administration, people were talking about how many people are don't have their rights back. And in his 4 years, his process awarded 150,000 former felons the right to vote. Governor Rick Scott, in the 8 years that he has been here, it's 3,000 people. They have a backlog. The board meets about every 3 months. They have about 400 cases they deal with every 3 months. They have a backlog of over 10,000 cases. When Governor Scott came into office, they reversed what was going on with the Charlie Crist administration, and they put so many barriers in people's way. After you serve your term, your probation, then you have to wait 5 years. And then after you wait 5 years, there's a 20-page document that you have to deal with. After that, then then the governor decides whether or not he wants to take your case, because the law in the Constitution, it says that the governor's actions in this area is unfair. That no one can do anything to stop him in terms of what case he's going to receive and who he is going to work with. So it's a system that is broken. It's a system that is unfair. And if we really want to make Florida great again, we'll change this approach. And the reason I say that, studies have shown that once a person has come out of the shadows and they have the ability to vote, and it says something about what they feel about themselves, and the rate of those people going back to prison, studies have shown it goes down. So do we want to have these people not have any hope? Because once you take away a person's hope, you're doomed them to a life of crime in our society.
Okay, and so I'd like you to respond a couple of points just to make sure that you hit on them that Dr. Lightfoot had mentioned. The numbers are pretty stark, and so the Scott administration is restoring the rights at a rate of about 1% of what the Crist administration did. There has been a lawsuit where it's found against the Scott administration because of its arbitrariness. That's been appealed. We're waiting to see what happens with this amendment. And so there's a difference between, or one might say there's a difference between tinkering and just outright abuse of a process that has significant implications. How do we protect against the abuse that we saw in this administration without having something like this amendment?
Well, okay, that's about 6 questions. So let me go back to the one you started with, because Professor Lightfoot talked about a lot of stuff, but he never answered the first part of your question, which was about what about the fact that Amendment 4 includes people convicted of violent crimes? This is the fundamental flaw in Amendment 4. Nobody really argues much about those hopeful stories that you hear about people that have truly changed their lives around. Maybe they committed a crime years ago. Maybe they stole something. Maybe they wrote a bad check, and they've done a good job of changing their lives around. Those are the easy cases. We all agree. When that person comes forward, the state of Florida ought to help that person back into society. Those are the easy cases. There's no dispute about that. The question is, what is the price for doing that? In order to accomplish that, do I have to also grant an automatic restoration to violent criminals? Men who abuse their wives, people who abuse elderly people in nursing homes, people who abuse children, armed robbers, carjackers, human traffickers. All of these people are covered by Amendment 4. So the question is, what trade-off are you willing to make? The easy cases are the easy cases. The violent criminals are the tougher cases, and it's interesting, I think you called it also, as the proponents do, talk about second chances, right? This is another flaw in Amendment 4. Everybody's in favor of giving folks a second chance. Americans are very forgiving. We like giving people a second chance. You get your second chance after you make your first mistake. So if you are a first-time convicted felon, that's the moment in time we should be talking about your second chance. If you've been committing felonies for the past 25 years and you've got a rap sheet 16 pages long, it seems to me that your second chance has long come and gone. So where do you want to go next? I know you had about 6 different topics. Well, the number of clemencies.
There's probably a lot of people in the room that believe that under the current administration, which will expire, that process was abused. Again, that rate and that backlog, 1% of what a former Republican governor did. So if we don't like that, how do we protect ourselves from the next person coming in and keeping something similar?
Well, again, clemency is fundamentally an act of mercy. The power to grant clemency ultimately resides with the governor, and it has always varied historically. Comparing Governor Scott's administration to Governor Christ's administration, his predecessor, is certainly fair, but we can compare it to lots of other previous administrations too. It rests with the governor, and if you don't like the way things are being done, the answer is elect a different governor. In terms of the number of clemencies granted, this turns on really how do you define success? And here's what I mean. Imagine 2 little brothers go out trick-or-treating at Halloween. One little brother brings home his bag of candy, and he's got 1,000 pieces of all different kinds of candy. The other little brother comes home, he's only got 500 pieces of candy in his bag. But all those 500 pieces are his favorite candy. Who did better? How do you define success? Is it granting more clemencies with a higher recidivism rate in that group because nobody's asking questions, or in the case of what Governor Scott has done, grant far fewer clemencies, but when you look at the recidivism rate in that smaller number of clemencies granted, it is startling. It is less than 1%. When you look at the recidivism rate in the larger group under Governor Christ, it's not much different than the overall historical recidivism rate of about 25%.
Let's go to our closing statements. Take up to about a minute or so.
I have to say this. I have to say that you're going to have a look at the recidivism rate for Governor Scott is going to be very low because we have a backlog of cases, over 10,000 cases. In order for them to meet that goal, to see all of those cases, it's going to take us a century. We don't have a century to wait on. See, the whole process is designed so that we put so many barriers in the way that people would just throw up their hands and say, I won't do it anymore. There was a situation that happened the state does a very poor job of telling people when they leave, do you have the right to vote? Can you vote? After they go through the process and they find that some people have found that they thought they had the right to vote and then they get put in jail because they were voting and didn't know that they would. And then we've had people say, okay, I've gone through this process. They cleared it up, but I'll never vote again. I don't want to take that chance again because I don't want people to think, I don't want to get involved in the legal system again. It's all about fairness. It's about equity. When it comes to felon rights, we have to look at it with a clear eye. Of the people that are placed in these institutions, 1 out of every 13 African Americans are lose their right to vote, while for non-whites, it's 1 out of every 53 persons. Now, what I'm saying is this: if we had that kind of disparity, shouldn't someone in the government say, wait a minute, something's wrong here? You have a smaller population that has a larger number of people in jail. Shouldn't we look at our process and see what we're doing wrong? Something has to be wrong here if it's that kind of a disparity. But my thing is this: when people can't get a job, they can't get a lease, they can't get a loan, they lose their kids because of that, and all of those kinds of things, they're doomed, and you can expect them to be back in the system again.
Thank you, Dr. Lightfoot. Mr. Harrison, closing comments.
Sure. Again, the easy cases are always the easy cases, and those are the ones on which it's very simple to get to agreement on. If Amendment 4 had been written to exclude all violent felons, if Amendment 4 had been written so that it only automatically restored rights to people convicted of nonviolent crimes, nobody would be here. We wouldn't be having this conversation. There would be zero opposition, and we'd all be talking about something far more exciting, like homestead exemptions. Mm-hmm. Somebody chose to draw that line. They left out the murderers and the rapists. That somewhat undermines the moral or philosophical argument, because if you really believe that you should get a clean slate when you serve your time in prison, well, why doesn't that apply to murderers and rapists too? So it's not an absolute moral argument. And once somebody draws that line, you invite the other side to have a debate about where's the right place to draw the line. What we suggest is the line should be moved, and it shouldn't be exclude just murderers and rapists. It ought to be, let's deal with nonviolent felons in one way, and automatic restoration might be the right way to go. Take that backlog out of the system, and then leave the system in place to deal with the harder cases, the cases of violent criminals or repeat offenders. This amendment goes too far, and the price is too high.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Round of applause for our...
I must say one last thing. I have to take the time. I know what you're talking about as far as violent criminals and things of that nature, but we have 6,500 people in the state of Florida that have their rights not been restored because they have been driving on a suspended driver's license. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our final pairing of the evening will be for Amendment 6. We're going to have Dr. Tara Newsom, Professor of Social and Behavioral Science, is going to be doing the Pro 6, and Mr. Derek Byrne, partner, Byrne Mallory Law Firm in St. Petersburg, is going to be doing the Con. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Tara Newsom, and I am lucky enough to be a professor at St. Pete College, and have been an academician for about 18 years, but I'm also a lawyer, so I have to give a lawyer's caveat here. Some of what we're going to talk about tonight is not representative of all of our personal feelings, and that this is an academic exercise. Many of us in this room don't believe that the constitutional bundling that we're faced with on our ballot is really either constitutional or fair. And so I just wanted to put that out there and defend my esteemed colleague David, as he did a wonderful job defending something I think personally was probably somewhat problematic. So I just needed to get that out there. And I also wanted to ask that Derek and I have at least an extra minute because of the substantive qualities of the constitutional amendment. Would that be okay? I think that'd be fair. I just want you all to take a minute, take a deep breath, because we've been talking about a lot of things. And imagine yourself at home. It's late at night, and you get a phone call. And it's that dreaded phone call of any one of us that's been a parent, and it's the police saying that your child has been killed. And not only killed, but killed by an ex-boyfriend that's been at your house eating Thanksgiving dinner, and you grieve, and you mourn, and you try to bury your daughter. You go to the cemetery to lay flowers. You go with your family members to move forward, go to the grocery store, and you're thinking the judicial process has handled this perpetrator, and you're faced with the accused. You had no notice that he was out. You were trying to move forward, and you're thrown. That's what Marsys Law and Amendment number 6 is predominantly about the rights of victims and victims' families to be protected. The U.S. Constitution sets aside 4 of the 10, almost half of the Bill of Rights, to the rights of the criminally accused. Amendment 4, 5, 6, and 8. And so Henry Nicholas, Dr. Henry Nicholas, which was the brother of the young woman that I described was killed because that was a true story, he decided to advocate for states' rights. And when he did that, he wanted states to codify in the state constitution the same types of victims' rights as the Constitution, the United States Constitution, had done for the rights of the criminally accused. The state of Florida currently protects the rights of victims, but they do that in state law. Many people, and I think some are in this room, are not necessarily trustworthy of the legislature not to have some type of whim to change rights that are protected. And so Amendment 6 seeks to enshrine victims' rights in the Constitution. 5 states of the 50 have already done so. 6 are currently in the 2018 election cycle looking at passing pieces of legislation that are very much called Marsys Law. Now, Amendment 6 doesn't just deal with Marsys Law and victim rights. It also seeks to change the amount of time that individuals have to appeal. In non-violent capital crimes, 2 years of appeal, and if a capital crime would be a 5-year extension. That seems to have an efficiency for both the accused and the victim. They also seek to provide a written notification to victims of their assailants and that they've been released, etc. Now remember Miranda versus Arizona. Miranda rights, when you're arrested, you read the Miranda rights. So it seems reasonable that if you read your rights, if you've committed a crime, that victims should be given written notification that the accused is out and about. Amendment 6 also seeks to change the state's laws in which right now, anytime there's a conflict between a victim's right and a right of accused, the right of the accused trumps the victim, which means that this Amendment number 6 would equalize victims' rights with the rights of the accused. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's in Amendment 6, okay? There are another provision, the second major provision, is that we seek to change the age limit on our judiciary from 70 to 75. Now, 7 states have state laws that prohibit anyone from serving past 75. 1 state, Vermont, says you can be 90, and 19 other states say there's no limit. And that's because we think of professional acumen of our jurists to sometimes get even greater as you age. And so that's another portion of Amendment number 6. And the last is what Professor Alcott talked about in the beginning, which is called the Chevron Doctrine. And the Chevron Doctrine, most of us have become familiar with because of the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation. I'm sorry, I've been thinking about that all day. And the Chevron Doctrine is the doctrine that when there's a conflict in an agency, that the jurist, the judge, actually gives deference to the agency's interpretation. Well, some people think that tips the balance in favor of the executive branch's interpretation of the law. And so by voting for Amendment 6, you're really voting for judicial liberty. You're voting for judicial freedom, and you're voting for the idea that justices are not bound by judicial deference to the agency's interpretation. They can consider it, they're not bound to it.
Thank you.
Mr. Byrne.
I would agree that this amendment, as it relates to the Chevron doctrine and the mandatory retirement age of judges, it makes sense. It's good legislation. But the problem is we can't vote for those two items without voting for the victim's right portion. And that's where the problems lie. It's important to start off by noting, as mentioned earlier, out of all of Florida's laws and regulations, a constitutional amendment is the most difficult to change. And your opportunity to change it, it's going to be a while. I believe every 20 years for certain committees, for a general election, every 2 years. If you find just one problem in this amendment, you should vote no. It's going to be tough to fix. Now, to start off, we already have victims' rights. A lot of this is already present. As we sit here today, Article 1, Section 15 of the Florida Constitution states that victims have the right to be informed, present, and heard at all stages of a criminal proceeding. That includes the person being released. That includes when they're charged. That includes the initial hearing where the court determines, will there be a no contact order in place? Will that defendant be prohibited from contacting the victim's family, friends, close ones, and the victim, him or herself? We also have Chapter 960 of the Florida statutes, which provide the following rights. The victim is to have a meaningful role, notice of all proceedings, allowed to attend the proceedings, allowed to be heard, to receive compensation or restitution, crisis prevention, lawful representation by an attorney, and prompt and timely disposition of the case. In other words, a speedy trial. Now, these rights, they give deference to the accused rights. And that sounds bad, right? When you hear the victim doesn't have the same rights as the accused, oh my goodness, that doesn't make me feel good. But what if that accused is wrongfully accused? Our entire criminal justice system is based upon the principle that we rather let 10 guilty people free than lock up one innocent person. If I was the father of the victim, if I was the victim, that'd be a tough pill to swallow. But if I'm the accused and I didn't do it, I sure want that protection. I don't want the government taking my freedom away because, oh, sorry, we need to make sure that the victim's taken care of. Well, we have laws in place to do that. Out of all the different little changes here, the biggest, the scariest change in this amendment is the right to a speedy trial. Now, that right already exists, but this amendment defines it. And now a victim could essentially force a trial to occur within 75 days. That's not the prosecutor. That's not the defense counsel. That's the victim. Really removed from the litigation, they're going to determine when you go to trial. I'm here to tell you it is very difficult to prep a big trial in 75 days. It's incredibly expensive. Most people can't afford it. So who's this really going to affect? Not the 1%, not the people who have millions of dollars to throw at this and make their problems go away. It's going to be people like me and you who cannot afford a $300,000 legal bill because they have to go to trial and their freedom depends upon it within 75 days. There are other issues. There are issues regarding the implementation of some of these rights, and we can go into detail, but instead I'd just like to wrap up with a quick little vignette. There was a gentleman in Central Oregon. His name was Joshua Horner. He was sentenced for 50 years for the sexual assault of a minor child. Luckily for him, the Innocence Project of Oregon picked up his case. Now, the victim in that instance said, the man shot her dog right in front of her before the attack happened. The Innocence Project actually found the dog. It was out of state. They had to track this Labrador down. And because they were miraculously able to find this dog, this man got his freedom back. Now, do we really want to shorten the length of time for that man to put on his defense? If he's in custody, he's not going anywhere. This puts too much of a burden on the everyday person who might be wrongfully accused. Recent study has shown 1 out of 25 individuals who received a death sentence were wrongfully convicted. That's scary. So there's no need to rush this. And I understand emotionally it feels good, give the victim the rights, but it's not right in this instance.
Okay, what I'm going to do is let's just stay on that front part for a second, just give you a chance to respond, and then you didn't engage in the back part, so I'll have a file. I'll press you on the back part of it just a little bit, and then we'll have closing comments.
Okay.
So just on Marsys Law, your
Just
law.
Marsys Law,
right.
okay. Listen, constitutionally, our framers set up the Constitution and the state followed suit. The Constitution is built on negative rights, freedom from government interference. There's an assumption that victims' rights would be upheld and elevated. The way that we've evolved in our application of jurisprudence hasn't kept up with that assumption from the framers. And all Marsys Law is really trying to do is trying to codify what was an assumption by our framers, that our jurisprudence would, of course, protect the rights of the accused. It seems reasonable also to expedite trials that only prolong it for the accused as well as the victim. It seems reasonable.
Okay, let me just come at 2, and then we'll do the closings. I just wanted to hit.
It would seem reasonable until it's you or one of your loved ones who's in that position. In that case, you'd want to have a little extra time to prepare. And again, they're not going anywhere.
Okay, so I'm going to poke you on the latter 2 parts.
Okay.
So if the extension of the mandatory age requirement, the retirement age, was a good idea, why wasn't it a good idea for the 3 liberal judges as well? Why did they?
Are you talking about the ones that are just about to be sunsetted off of it? I don't think that it is a bad idea for them, but you can't.
They don't apply, so they have to.
They don't apply. So take me to where you want to go, because you can't retroactively apply the constitutional amendment back. So I don't think you're making an assumption that the increasing the age to 75 is to deal with the 3 that are looking.
No.
Okay, so help me flesh out.
Could they have set the effective date of the constitutional change so that the 3 judges would be treated the way that the other 4 judges are that are currently? So
you're asking me if this age limit, why shouldn't it apply?
I'm insinuating that they set the date purposely to knock the 3 liberal judges and extend the time horizon for the conservative ones.
I was slow for a moment, and I appreciate that. You made the point. I think that's terrible.
Okay. So, and then on the Chevron doctrine, yeah, and I'm not a lawyer, although I did stay at Holiday Inn Express last night. My understanding of the Chevron doctrine is that it's there. There is no obligation for a judge. There's other types of deference doctrines. There's a few of them. Judges can rule as they wish. It's just that the Florida Supreme Court has used it. They've relied upon that and used it as justification for the decisions. This amendment would prohibit that. So couldn't you look at it?
Well,
this is not a judicial liberty. This is actually the opposite of judicial liberty.
I think there's a confusion that stare decisis, which is the idea that we use our laws and then we use common law to guide our interpretation of the laws, is often means that we look at things like doctrines like Chevron doctrine, okay? But the amendment prohibits it from using it as the sole guiding light, or in another way, that the initial gut reaction of the jurist would be to defer to how the agency interpreted it. It doesn't prohibit the jurist from considering it as part of its breadth of information in which they're going to decide the case. So I think that's been mischaracterized by the media in understanding the amendment, part of what's been going on with all the confusion with bundling so many amendments like this.
Closing statement.
Okay. Equality. It's the basis of our entire social contract. Victims' rights, victims' equality with those of the right of the accused. That's what's at stake here. Reasonable laws regarding our jurists' age. We have wonderful professional jurists who, as they age, they become wise, they become seasoned, and that we want to capture their wisdom in their decisions on the bench, and by allowing for 5 extra years, we're able to be afforded that wisdom. And then finally, judicial freedom, to not be bound by an agency's decision, often, remember this, when the agency has I'm not going to insinuate, I'm just going to say the executive branch of the state pushed their interpretation of that law in the direction of which they want the law to be applied, not allowing the freedom to the judiciary to interpret it on its face.
With respect to the mandatory retirement age, the proposal makes sense, but it should be more on a case-by-case basis. We all age differently, and to draw a bright and hard line at 75 years of age isn't fair. There's some judges who should be on the bench till they're 80. Think about Ruth Ginsburg for a second. There's other judges who maybe before 70 that we should be taking a look at things. So just to have a bright line rule, it should be the individual. As for the victim's rights, the victim, unfortunately, was already harmed. Their rights were already infringed upon. Now, the question is, what are we going to do with this accused person's rights? And they are afforded due process. They should have the opportunity to present a meaningful defense, and they should not be constricted with unreasonable timelines that make it financially impossible to defend one's freedom.
Thank you. Round of applause for Mr. Byrne, Dr. Hussein. David, is there a traveling mic if questions are directed to some of our panelists? Okay. So we're now moving on to the question and answer session. I'll probably defer to our panelists unless it's a factual question on the amendments that were covered by the debates, and I'll handle the other ones. Ma'am, right up here in front, and then in the back, second. And then we'll go over there.
I was going to say, I wanted to inquire about the Disney money, and it seems counterintuitive that they should be backing this amendment. Can you go into that a little bit more, please?
A quick comment, and then if anybody wants to add anything. Disney has long been against the expansion of gambling in the state of Florida. I believe just the image of the state and family-friendly tourism it's part of the brand of Disney. I think there's concern that more gambling means more tarnishment of that brand. It also might be viewed as a competition in terms of a different type of experience. Let's just say if the hoteliers in Southeast Florida were able to start to make that look a little bit more like Vegas. So I think it's for those reasons that Disney would like to make it as difficult as possible to expand gambling in the state of Florida. Anything else or is that okay? Okay, over there, ma'am.
Yes. If we're arguing that recidivism, and it's a hard word for me to pronounce, occurs so often, doesn't that in fact take care of the felons who go back into the system not being able to vote?
Okay,
I mean, I'm a former law enforcement officer, and most people who are not interested in the democratic process are not going to vote at all. If they're felons. Those who really want to vote should be given a chance because they're really interested in the democratic process. But I want to know about the recidivism unless I don't know something. If you're back in prison, you can't vote.
Mr. Harrison. Do we have a second?
Thank you. And recidivism is a hard word for everybody to say. There's got to be a better word. Your point is an interesting one because there's a lot of people that think they understand what the impact of this amendment is going to be. We hear talk about 1.5 million felons. We hear a lot of speculation about, well, if those folks were automatically restored the right to vote, what percentage might register as Democrats and what percentage might register as Republicans? And frankly, that's all wild, rampant speculation. The answer is nobody has any earthly idea. And then once you get past the question of to what extent will restored felons actually register to vote, one way or the other, will they do it at all? Then we get to what number have actually registered and what percentage of them will then actually take the next step and participate in an election. just among the general population, we know that the participation rate is not what we would like it to be. We would like to have a lot more people who are eligible, number one, go register, and people who are registered, number two, actually participate and vote. We all want those numbers to be higher. So there's a lot of wild speculation about what the practical impact of this amendment will really be. And the answer is nobody has any earthly idea. As with most of these amendments, though, you can get a little bit of insight into what people are thinking by looking at where the money's coming from. We talked a little bit about the money on the oil and gas stuff, the money on the gambling amendment, the money, if you look at the dog amendment, the money's coming from the animal rights organizations. On the felon restoration amendment, they've raised about 15.5, coming up close on $16 million. The bulk of it's from the ACLU. Almost all the rest of it is from liberal organizations based outside of Florida. So there's a lot of people that don't live here trying to tell us how the Florida Constitution ought to work.
Sir, but you didn't answer my questions about how does recidivism then, if you're saying that, first of all, the trends of voting, as we can tell by the last election, will never change. Voting is an ongoing thing, women, sometimes minorities, so none of us control that, right? It's an ongoing thing. But if recidivism is a concern, it isn't once the felon who gets out, and by the way, most felonies are not violent. So we have possession, we have white collar crimes. Someone commits those. How is that going to affect them? If they're back in the slammer, as we say it, they cannot vote. Correct?
Right.
And as far as the other points you make, trends in voting are constantly going to be changing. The last thing I'd like to mention is, I'm from Chicago. The last time I checked in Chicago, the ACLU, which we seem to term as a liberal organization, protected neo-Nazis for marching and skulking in a Jewish neighborhood. So I'm not really sure it could be perceived as, but I believe the ACLU also defends the rights of any infringement of perceived infringement of the law.
Need to move on, but coming back to the recidivism question, I think the general idea is, well, you don't want to give voting rights to bad guys or bad women, but if they commit more crimes, then their votes get taken away when they go back to prison. So.
Well, sure, and the question is which way makes more sense to do it? Do we restore rights to everybody and hope for the best, or do we take a more common sense approach and say, if you're telling me you've changed your life around, take a couple of years, don't get in trouble, and show me you've changed your life. So it's a different approach.
We had something over here, yeah, and then that woman in the white shirt, right over here. Okay.
Are you aware of any issues that were discussed at the CRC that did not make it to an amendment form, such as Florida's primary election situation?
They were not going to change the Florida primary election situation. So no. So I mean, we could. There are many, many things that did not make it on to the ballot. There was actually a citizens initiative that got through the first hurdle a cycle ago called All Voters Vote that would have done the California-style primary system. There were a few proposals in the hopper. None of them got very serious consideration. The one thing that I'm not going to spend too much time on that almost got on, and I'm mad at them, was that loophole in the where if there's no candidate that runs in an election, then the primary is opened up. And so that was something that was explicitly put in by the last Constitution Revision Commission, and then this ruling that we've had, there's a little story behind it, but where write-in candidates can be used in order to close off elections. Everybody knows it's not what the last CRC meant. They had this one, it made it to the very final round, and then it just fell a little bit below the threshold to get onto your ballot. So it got taken off that fix at the very end. Ma'am.
The more I research all of these amendments, it just seems like most of them really don't belong in the Constitution. Am I incorrect?
I can't give you a correct or an incorrect. So what I would go back and say is that You have to bring your own judgment about what belongs in the Constitution. I would note, though, that what we find in state constitutions around the Union, around the country, very, very different than the spare federal constitution that, for the most part, simply establishes the rights of individuals, sets up the branches of governments, and pretty much that's it. Everything else is done through statute or congressional law. State constitutions are all over the place. And so it is what it is. It got there on purpose. You have to make your own judgments about what you think belongs in the Constitution and what doesn't. Okay. There, I see a hand over here, and then one in the blue, and gentleman up front, and another lady right here. Sir, we'll come over to this for one or two.
Well, forgive my ignorance, but what right does the state have to cancel the voting rights of any individual when it's guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution? The right to vote. I never could understand why, how the state can get away with it, or any state.
It's the 10th Amendment.
So the 10th Amendment in the Constitution says the rights not granted to the federal Constitution.
It goes to the states, so each state.
I'm sorry, the rights not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. And if the states don't take it on, it's reserved to you, sir. So you make a good point, but the state would assert their 10th Amendment reserved rights to say, hey, if the federal government didn't take it on, we're going to take it on.
Oh, so the federal government never contested it. Is that why you're saying it?
They didn't, what they call, occupy the field. The federal government would never occupy the field or do get in the business of setting state election laws. It's one of those areas in which both the federal government and the state have what's called shared powers, or another word for it is concurrent powers. They have the same time, they have the authority to govern. So that's why the feds can set up a federal election and the states can set up a state election, and why state legislatures can reach into liberties that might seem to be what we would call unalienable, but the Constitution is allowed for the state, the federal Constitution allows for the state to dabble in it, and it's up to us as Floridians to put a stop to it if we think it's too much. And that's why it's so important that this constitutional amendment is on the ballot, so Floridians can speak and exercise what you're making very reasonable sense.
Thank you, Dr. Newsom. There was one hand here over in front, and then the blue sweater in the back, and then, oh, I'm sorry, after you, ma'am.
So if I could just take a moment and point everybody to Amendment 7. And there's I am Susan Demers, I'm one of the deans here at SPC, and there's a little part of it that we didn't talk about in the original overview, which is Amendment 7 enshrines the state college system in the Florida Constitution. So, the K through 12 is in the Constitution, the state university system is in the Constitution, but the state college system is not in the Constitution. So if the other parts of Amendment 7 are not anathema to you, I would ask you to consider enshrining the Florida college system, which last year educated over 800,000 Floridians in freshman through senior years, as part of the Florida Constitution. And we did sponsor this tonight, so I'm taking a little point of privilege here.
Thank you. We did mention it, but we didn't say too much about it. Let's come around this side and then up front here, and then right there we have, she's been waiting for a while.
Was it you? Okay. I just wanted to address this issue about what belongs in the Constitution or doesn't. I'm Susan Glickman. I'm the Florida Director of Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and I came tonight because I originally was going to take the yes on 9 position, and the oil industry isn't here, so we're not discussing that at great length. But you come up with a very legitimate question about why would we want to put oil drilling ban or a smoking ban or whatever it is in the Constitution. And that's because in Florida, we have no ability to amend our statutes. So it's the only way. I was involved in 2002 when we put into the state constitution a ban on workplace smoking. As Frank mentioned, we're going to be amending that to add the technology on vaping as well as the drilling ban. In 2009, the Florida House of Representatives voted to lift this ban. It is the only sort of tool that we have. And yeah, maybe that's not the ideal place for a policy on smoking, but if it was up to the Florida legislature, we'd still be smoking in restaurants. That only happened because we had a citizen-led initiative that went to the ballot. So I am here to say to take the time and vote yes on 9, because we cannot trust the Florida legislature, because the oil industry comes in and showers them with money, and the Florida House of Representatives voted to lift that ban. So let's put it in that Constitution and get a further protection so we protect our economy. So that's why. So I wanted to answer more generally that it's the only avenue that we have. So anyway, I would ask you respectfully to vote yes on 9.
Okay, we have a striped shirt here in the front and the blue back there. Blue blouse back there too? Here. Ma'am.
Okay, thank you. That's exactly what I was going to ask, because she was just talking about Amendment 9, and it has to do with the offshore drilling. And I know that is in the Florida statute currently, that you can't. So that's my question. What if we put it in the Constitution, that's going to be very, very hard to change either one of these. When it's a statute, then you could always change it or do something to the statute. But once you put something in the Constitution, just like we're doing right now, and when you're bundling these, to me that is so ridiculous to even allow them to do that. There should be individual amendments. I can't understand. It doesn't make any sense to me that anybody would do something like that.
Your intuition is correct in that in the state of Florida, historically, because we have allowed for a number of different vehicles that you don't always have in other states to change the Constitution, you do get areas of citizen frustration around topics where the legislature refused to act and the public sentiment is strongly in one direction. They've used this vehicle, constitutional change, to push something. Again, anything from money going into purchasing environmental lands to the smoking ban. The other thing that happens sometimes is for political reasons, one side or another wants to make what they do more difficult to change. And so by putting something in the Constitution, it is not so easy to undo it. You got to go back into the Constitution to undo it.
That's what I'm saying about the drilling. We already have that in the statute.
Yes, the legislature tried to act. It would have to act in order to make that change. This would take it away, that discretion from the legislature, until somebody went back in and changed that amendment. Okay, that's, ma'am.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the felons' rights again to vote. It seems since Florida is just one of 4 states who doesn't allow felons to vote again, that we could get some information about what would happen if that were passed, instead of saying that we would have no earthly idea how many felons would actually vote. Do we have any information about what goes on in the other states that do allow felons to vote?
The ACLU has information on that. You can also go, if you just want, the Ballotpedia is pretty good at keeping up. It's not very user-friendly, but the Ballotpedia Florida amendments has a pretty good running total of, again, where money's coming from, what arguments are on either side, and some links to other places. There is uncertainty in terms of what the response would be, but it's not complete uncertainty in terms of the numbers of people that would have their rights restored. Ma'am.
Just one quick question. Who determines who is going to serve on the Constitutional Revision Commission?
Oh, I should have did that in the beginning. I thank you for asking that question. Who determines is in our Constitution. So these procedures that happen once every 20 years, there are 37 members of the Constitution Revision Commission. 15 of them are appointed by the governor. 9 of them are appointed by the Senate President. 9 of them are appointed by the Speaker of the House. 3 of them are appointed by the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and the Attorney General, the sitting Attorney General, serves on it as well. Historically, we've done this 3 times. In the 70s, 77, 78, 33 Democrats, 4 Republicans. 97, 98, pretty balanced, very even number of Democrats, Republicans. This last cycle, 33 Republicans, 4 Democrats. More questions? Ma'am, in the white. I can repeat your question.
On Amendment 1, a lot of people think, well, this is a bonus to your paycheck. People, you need to know that when the local governments lose the money that they will lose when you vote for Amendment 1, the services you will lose, like infrastructure improvements and all kinds of things, are going to be a real strain. So what has to happen, and I serve on a financial committee in one of our governments, then we have to raise the millage rate. So you may think you're getting more money, but you will end up paying more taxes in another way. So think seriously about that. It's not such a gift.
Okay. David, I think we've exhausted our questions, and we are back on time. I'm actually now ahead of time. Dave asked me to do a wrap-up. I really just have one ask. David, is this going to be online at some point?
Yes. Oh.
Okay. So my one ask of you is, I think you can tell how much is on the ballot, and they're not inconsequential changes to our state constitution. And so it would make me extremely happy if each Floridian voter would spend an hour and just find out what's on their ballot, and so that they can be informed however or wherever they cast their vote. But you're all here, and so I really commend you for taking time out of your evenings to learn a little bit more, and you're now among the ranks of the informed voters, we hope. But I think, you know, just friends, family, I have a number of students as a professor. A lot of them are first-time voters. They have no clue right now. We're only about 5-6 weeks out. They have no clue that they're going to be casting votes on 12 different state constitutional amendments. And so trying to give some people that you know a nudge. You don't care which direction you nudge them in, but get them to pay attention to what's coming up on their ballot. Either watch the videos here, or there's some resources out there. I'm not going to specify anything, but it's not that hard to find out a little bit more information about these amendments. And there's no way you're going to walk in cold and make informed decisions or exercise good judgment. So that's my simple ask. Thank you for coming, but try to get 2 or 3 other people to learn a little bit about these amendments before they vote. Thank you.
And our the video of this will be posted probably by Tuesday or so of next week. It takes 3 or 4 work days to get it edited into a format. And I will echo what Frank said about the importance of these amendments and how hard it is to understand them. You all have gotten some better ideas now, so please tell your friends and family that this video will be available, and tell them what you learned, too. I hope if I could just give a little plug for some of our upcoming events. Next week, on October 4th, we're going to have all our candidates for local office in one room, sharing pizza and soda and talk. That's on this campus over in the conference center of the library. I hope you'll come. That's from 6 to 8 p.m. On October 8th at our Midtown campus, another in our series on sea level rise impacts, our climate change impacts in our sea level rise initiative. This is on the health impacts of climate change, and that will be our Midtown campus on October 8th at 6 p.m. 6 or 6:30? 6 to 7:30. And on October 10th at our Midtown campus, if you've watched CNN at all, you may have seen Bakari Sellers. He's one of their regular commentators, and he is a very passionate advocate for social justice. He'll be speaking then. That's free, and that's from 6 to 8 p.m. And on October 24th, in the conference center also, our dinner series, our topic is the F word. No, not that one. Fake news. Fake news. We're going to be dissecting that, and I'm sure you will learn a lot if you will show up. I think that's all we have. Thank you all for coming. Good night and a safe journey home. And I mentioned about retrogression. I'm going to go home and retrogress into Murphy Brown reboot. Murphy Brown at 9:30.